Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another conversation in North Dakota history. My name is Larry Remley, and it's my pleasure to serve as your host for this, another in our series of discussions with scholars about the history and culture of North Dakota. As with all of the other programs in this series, this one is funded by a grant to the State Historical Society from the North Dakota Humanities Council. Our guest is Mr. Chris Dill, who is the Director of the Museum Division for the State Historical Society of North Dakota. And our topic will be Fort Clark, a North Dakota historic site that has been a prairie post and a field lab since its establishment in 1831. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Let's begin with a very general question. Fort Clark is a major North Dakota historic site. Can you briefly describe its place in the history of North Dakota?
Fort Clark is a site which contains remnants of a Mandan Indian village and two fur trading posts. The larger of those posts, Fort Clark, is the operation from which the site took its name. It was an American Fur Company trading post from 1831 to 1860. The American Fur Company had a virtual monopoly on the upper Missouri River fur trade, the western fur trade in North Dakota, from the 1830s until the 1860s, when the fur trade pretty much expired, pretty much went away. Fort Clark was one of three major posts run by the American Fur Company, the others being Fort Pierre in South Dakota and Fort Union up by the Montana border. And while it was the third most important economically to the American Fur Company, it was certainly the premier post, as far as I'm concerned, in North Dakota's history, because of the things that happened there, because of the artwork that exists from the site, because of some of the records that were left from the site.
So there's a considerable body of cultural remain from that particular historic site's period of existence as a historic location.
Yes, there are particularly two kinds of remains. One being the historical documentation. There's a great wealth of historical documentation, not only the artwork, but journals, and journals that were kept there, journals of people who came through the place. And the second, of course, is the archaeological remain. The site, which as a state historic site has 231 acres in it, has about 100 acres of archaeological remains, Indian village, associated burial ground, two forts, a whole variety of other features that were associated with one or the other of those.
So let's set the stage for discussing Fort Clark's place in the history of North Dakota. Where's the site located, and what's its general geographic and stratigraphic relationship to the countryside around it?
Fort Clark is located about 7 miles south of Stanton, 12 miles west of Washburn. That puts it about 60 miles north of Bismarck. It's along the west side of the Missouri River. It sits on the first high bedrock terrace above the Missouri River floodplain, so that it's physically it's on a little shelf that hangs out from the side of the Missouri River trench. And in that location, it is in an ecotonal area between the prairies and the gallery forest of the Missouri River bottoms. And it's also on a lower level so that it received some protection as a place to live from the elements, because it wasn't out on the open prairie. It was also close enough to the river so that it was directly serviced by steamboats for most of its existence.
And then who lived there?
The Mandan Indians moved into the village at Fort Clark, which was named Mitutahankush, as Maximilian was told. I think that in the original Mandan it would have been Mitutahaktosh, which translates as first village or east village. The Mandan moved in either 1822 or 1823. We're a little confused, I think, about the exact date in part because of the historical record. The site is presently accessible via Highway Alternate 200 between Washburn and Stanton. It has a paved road into it so that people can actually get to it.
Okay. The first people then moved in relatively late in the prehistoric period, in the early 19th century. From whence did they come, the native peoples who occupied the site that became Fort Clark?
The Mandan were originally woodland peoples who, according to modern theory, migrated out of southern Minnesota and northern Iowa over the Missouri River fairly early on, about 1000 AD, and started moving northward along the Missouri River. Immediately prior to their living at Fort Clark, they lived in the Bismarck-Mandan area at sites such as Double Ditch and Slant Village. Double Ditch is a state historic site. Slant Village is at Fort Lincoln State Park. There are a number of other sites in the Heart River mouth area, which they lived in until there was a smallpox epidemic about 1780 to 81, and they then moved northward. They moved into Fort Clark in 1822, and there was a fort then built near them soon after that.
And that fort was?
Tilton's Post, which was built by James Kipp, then an employee of the Columbia Fur Company. And it was a small fort we know very little about other than it was there. It was a small fort that was somewhere near the village. There's a debate as to whether it was upstream or downstream. And when Kipp was asked in 1833 when the place was occupied, he was asked by Maximilian, he said that it was 11 years earlier. That would have made it 1822. And it was also told that it was the same year that the Arikara village in South Dakota was in conflict with Leavenworth and Ashley, and that would have been 1823. So we're a little confused as to whether it was 22 or 23. I'm inclined to think that it was 1822, although I don't have any very good reason for that, I guess.
So essentially, the Mandan occupied the area and were followed almost immediately by the first of the fur traders.
The fur traders had been working the area for many years prior to that, particularly fur traders, English and French fur traders coming down from the northeast, from the Lake Winnipeg area. The territory at that point was the property of the United States. In the late 1790s and around the turn of the century. The Columbia Fur Company is one of several that started up in the St. Louis area and started working the upper river in response to the Lewis and Clark expedition having come through and opened the territory up for American trade. The Columbia Fur Company employed James Kipp, who had been around for some time, and Kipp supplied that post overland from the Lake Traverse area. Lake Traverse is on the Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota juncture down in the southeastern corner of North Dakota.
Okay, why did the fur traders come to that area? What about that particular location attracted them?
The fur trade had for years, many years, concentrated primarily on the beaver. And the reason that they wanted beaver was that the underfur of the beaver could be matted and felted, and they made the tall hats out of them, what one might think of now as a silk hat. And in fact, that was really the demise of the fur trade in the long run, that the fact that the fur hat was, the beaver fur hat was replaced by silk hats. The American Fur Company, which was started as a beaver fur operation in the Great Lakes area by John Jacob Astor out of New York, became involved in this western department because they had depleted the supplies to the east and northeast of here and were expanding to the west. Part of the reason that people came directly to the Mandans was that there were buffalo here in greater numbers, and they were interested in the buffalo hides. Another part of the reason, which is sort of tangential to the fur trade, I suppose, is that it's a long ways from the central part of the Canadian prairies back to Montreal. And if one wants to run supplies back and forth, that gets to be a long distance to cover. The Mandan and Hidatsa and Arikara later were raising corn, beans, squash, sunflowers, a variety of other things like that in and around their villages. And the fur traders were actively getting foodstuffs from them to support the northern fur trade. They also collected a lot of muskrat furs and a lot of buffalo, some bear. Buffalo and muskrat were the two highest takes out of this area. The reason the fur traders came to Fort Clark specifically is that there was a village of Indians living there who lived on that terrace in that village year-round, year after year after year. And by year-round, I mean that they lived there during the spring, summer, and fall months, and they'd move away to another location further down, lower into the Gallery Woods for protection in the winter, but they would move back into the villages on the terraces for the bulk of the year, and they lived there year after year. So they were already sourced. They'd been involved in a fur trade in a trade system for centuries. The trading system started with people trading things that they didn't have to other people who were adjacent to them, and networking all across the continental United States 8 to 10,000 years BC. We see this in archaeological sites with Knife River flint, for instance, which is a local material to North Dakota being traded roughly from Lubbock, Texas to Calgary, Alberta, and from Wisconsin to Idaho prehistorically. Many, many other items. We find things coming in to North Dakota, such as seashells from the Gulf Coast and the northwest coast, Washington and Oregon area. We find native copper having been mined, particularly north and east of here, traded in here and made into local artifacts. We find obsidian, which is a black volcanic glass, quite regularly in North Dakota archaeological sites. It's a better material than Knife River flint, but it was harder to obtain because it was a trade material. It was something you had to import in. And most of that seems to have come from the Yellowstone Park area. It wasn't a park at that point, but the resources were still being used.
So essentially, the fur traders established themselves at that area that became Fort Clark because it was, first of all, an occupied site. Yes. With an established group of Indians who had been trading and involved in a prehistoric trade network for
Yes.
many, many years. All right, let's move on to the establishment of Fort Clark itself. Fort Clark was established in 1830 or 31.
James Kipp, working for the Columbia Fur Company, had established Tilton's Post in 1822 or 23. Shortly thereafter, I think he established the fort in 1822, and in 1823, after the conflict, 120 miles south, he abandoned it, and he's then listed as living in the village. In 1826, the American Fur Company, establishing its beachhead in the northern plains, purchased the Columbia Fur Company, and in that guise collected Kipp into its fold. Excuse me. Kipp operated in and around the Mandan village for the intervening years. In 1829 and 30, he helped build Fort Union up by the Montana-North Dakota border along the Missouri River. And in the succeeding years, 1830 to 31, he came down to Fort Clark and cut the logs in the fall of 1830 and let them cure, and then in 1831, early 1831, built Fort Clark next to the Mandan village. He had been a resident there for some time, had been operating there for some time, and they decided to build a more substantial fort. The American Fur Company subsequently sold its operation, called the Upper Missouri Outfit, to Pierre Choteau Jr. and Company in 1834, which was not long after the fort was built. Pierre Choteau and his family had been the suppliers, the merchandisers in St. Louis for many years for all sorts of fur trade operations. And as Astor decided that this just wasn't economically viable, he'd been in it 10 years, he decided that the Western fur trade wasn't what he wanted in terms of profit margin and activities. His supplier basically said, well, I think it's worthwhile. I'll buy it. And he bought the place out and kept the names because they had been established. Much as a business today someone would buy a business today and keep the name because of its reputation. He kept the American Fur Company name and the Upper Missouri Outfit name, even though they technically weren't John Jacob Astor's company anymore.
So Fort Clark then changed hands shortly after it
Yes.
was originally constructed. Can you track the rest of the history, just briefly sketch the rest of the history of the fort's ownership system and its occupation until it was closed?
The fort and the Upper Missouri Outfit remained the property of the Pierre Chateau Jr. and Company until it closed in 1860. The southern third of the fort appears to have burned in 1860. I have seen several references to that happening in August or September of 1860. And when we got into the archaeology of the site, the southern third of the fort had very definitely burned. We don't know how it burned or why it burned. Old wooden forts are prone to that sort of thing. They did have a blacksmith shop. They had fireplaces. They had cook stoves, all the same sort of thing that you would expect in any place that people live. It appears that in 1860, the traders then moved a little bit north, closer to the village, and occupied another fort structure that happened to have been built there. In dealing with the history of the site, the Mandan had moved in 1822, and they lived in the village there until 1837. In June of 1837, a steamboat named the St. Peter's, which was a regular supply boat coming upriver, stopped at the Fort Clark village, and by the middle of July of 1837, Francois Chardon, the head trader or bourgeois of Fort Clark, was recording smallpox cases within the village. There are a variety of stories about how all of that happened. There's a suggestion that a trader by the name of Jacob Halsey, who was on the boat going to Fort Union, was infected and infected people as he went along, and he in fact survived the smallpox and wrote a letter to the American Fur Company sometime later apologizing profusely for having wiped out their trade. He didn't particularly apologize for all of the deaths, but he apologized for having wiped out their economic base on the Northern Plains. In recent years, it's been suggested that in fact was not exactly how it happened. Halsey, by the time he got to Fort Clark, would not have been infectious anymore. And there were some Indian peoples on the boat who got off at Fort Clark who may have been exposed downriver and who came off the boat at Fort Clark and may have infected the Northern Plains in that sense. We're not exactly sure, and we may never be, because that was quite some time ago and those folks aren't around. It's a little difficult to examine that very directly.
Nevertheless, then, the smallpox epidemic of 1837 was a pivotal event in the history of the site.
The Mandan were reduced by an estimated 98% in terms of total population. The Mandan had been living in 2 villages at that point and were reduced, some estimated, to 150 people total by the end of that smallpox epidemic. Chardon's journal, which he kept from 1834 to 39, covering this time period, has been reprinted and has a fairly graphic description of what happened and some of the things that he tried to do in response to the epidemic. The Mandan left the Fort Clark village in August of 37 and went out on what was left of them went out on their winter hunt and moved into a winter village, and when they came back in the spring of 38, discovered that the Arikara had moved in. It's been suggested that the Arikara had had a crop failure the year before and were interested in the stored crop goods that were in the Fort Clark village and recognized that the Mandan in greatly reduced numbers would neither need it or be able to defend it very well. And the Arikara then lived in the village there until 1861, at which point they moved north and in the following year, 1862, joined the remnants of the Mandan and Hidatsa at like a fishhook village. The other primary feature at the fort then is Primo's Post. Charles Primo and Alexander Harvey were both clerks for the American Fur Company, clerks and traders, and they apparently became unhappy about the financial arrangements that they had. Most fur traders who weren't actually running an operation, I'm sure, were unhappy at one point or another about their wages. And they started a company called Harvey Primo and Company in St. Louis about 1850. And they came to Fort Clark. They sent Primo to Fort Clark, and he built a little post between Fort Clark and the village so that the Indians had to walk by his post to be able to get to the larger one. And this wasn't an unusual sort of a thing. The American Fur Company constantly had to put up with people who said, hey, this is a good deal on the trade. I think I'll go out and start a competing company. They usually ran them out or bought them out or something happened to them. In any case, they didn't last very long. Harvey Primo and Company appears to have been there for about 10 years. We don't know the opening date or the closure date on Primo's Post. There may be records associated with that matter in the Chateau Papin papers at the Missouri Historical Society, which we've only begun to glean at this point. Primo's Post was a smaller post, was closer to the village, and it directly competed with Fort Clark.
Mm-hmm. Were there other posts that were established also on that site?
There were no other. Tilton's Post and Primo's Post and Fort Clark were the only fur trading posts established right there. Fort Union had a whole variety of little competitors that sprang up over the years. Tilton's Post, of course, was earlier, so it was really Primo's Post and Fort Clark that competed with each other directly at that site.
Then we can assume then that even though the smallpox decimated the original Indian inhabitants or the original group at that particular site, that they did not interrupt or even seriously disturb the fur trade at that location.
Well, the American Fur Company wanted to pull out at the juncture when the smallpox epidemic happened. I think they presumed it was going to hurt the fur trade. The loss of population and the fact that their regular trading partners had moved. The Aureka stood up and said, wait a minute, folks, you can't leave here. We're going to be extremely upset and we'll cause trouble if you close this fort down. So the company kept the fort open, and it apparently was viable for years after that. And they did, in fact, have an operation there from 1838 when the Aureka moved in until 1860 or 61. The fort burned in 60, and they were there, I think, until the spring of 61. They wintered through the 60-61 winter.
So basically it was just that the suppliers of the raw materials changed rather than the fort's purpose did.
This was a fur trading post, not a fur trapping operation. There are really two kinds of things that went on in the American West with furs and the Euro-Americans. Jim Bridger and all of those folks of legend were fur trappers. They went out themselves and took traps and went into the mountains and trapped and wintered and hauled the stuff back and went to rendezvous. That was a pretty labor-intensive sort of a thing and didn't support a very large operation. It was also a generation earlier than the Western river fur trade, if you would. The Western fur trade of Fort Clark and Fort Union and Fort Pierre was one where the traders came and sat in the villages, whether they were in forts or just residents in the villages, and got the Indians through the course of the year to trap this material, and the Indians then brought it to them, and there was a purchase or a trade that went on. They were trading guns, traps, metal, some pottery, all sorts of personal adornment, cooking utensils, knives, everything that you could think of into the Indian villages. And the Indians, having long been established in a trading operation, were perfectly adapted to work that kind of thing into their trade network. As metal pots came in, the clay pots made by the Indians were dropped, perhaps figuratively and literally. The Indians quit making pottery. They quit making stone arrowheads for the most part because they had access to sheet metal and chisels and files, and made arrowheads that lasted longer and held an edge better, and I think were as sharp, perhaps not quite as sharp, but close to as sharp as flint. Flint is very much like glass, so you can get a very sharp edge on it, but it doesn't hold that edge very well. Porcupine quill work, which was originally used as a decoration on outfits, disappeared almost completely and was replaced by beadwork because the beads were easy. In the first place, you didn't have to go catch a porcupine. You simply got the beads out of the bag or off of a string, and the beads came in more and more permanent colors than one could get with the native minerals to dye porcupine quills. Blue was a color that prehistorically was practically unknown on the northern plains because there are no mineral sources to make blue color with here. So blue beads were extremely popular. Most of these beads were made in Europe and shipped through the system, traded through the system into St. Louis and then up the river.
Fort Clark then was an agent in a cultural transformation as well as an economic,
yes.
Had an economic reason for being there.
The people at Fort Clark had a large effect on the cultural operation by bringing in different things: the pottery, the glass, the cloth, so that one spent a little less time working on hides if one could get a cloth shirt, and on top of that it could be a different color. There were some social differences. They brought alcohol in. They brought diseases in, not deliberately. Certainly the last thing the fur traders wanted to do was wipe out the population that they were using to keep their economy going. The money is not something particularly that came in. In all of the work that I've done at Fort Clark, I have never seen a coin come from Fort Clark. It was a trade system. Reading some of the accounts and literally the accounts, the account books from Fort Clark, the old saw about St. Peter, don't you call me, I can't go, I owe my soul to the company store may have been true. I've seen a couple of account books that suggest that a fellow who had worked upriver for 4 years owed the American Fur Company about 3 times what he had made during that time period, because they paid him a small wage and they just wrote that down on the chit. And whenever he went into the company store to get some piece of clothing or some flintlock parts or some gunpowder or a stick of tobacco or whatever, they'd write that down, and at the end of 3 years he owed them considerably more than he had gained in wages.
Well, so we had basically the economic reason, or the economic aspect of Fort Clark as a business. We had its cultural impact upon the natives who lived nearby and traded with the fort. What other areas of importance did the fort have in Western history? Was it a source for cultural and historic commentary, for example?
Fort Clark was one of the major stops that the riverboats made. The first steamboat up the river this far was the Yellowstone, which was a Pierre Chateau Jr. and Company boat, as was almost everything. They really did have a monopoly up here. The Yellowstone came up in 1832 and made it as far as Fort Union. It had 1,500 gallons of liquor on it. After the steamboats came this far, it became much easier to get all sorts of things in here, and we find the forts having window glass, for instance. You might not think of window glass as a particularly significant thing, but shipping a sheet of window glass 1,200 miles overland on a horseback or in a cart from St. Louis to Fort Clark was a pretty phenomenal sort of a thing. When the steamboats started coming up with the volume that they could carry, they carried all sorts of things in, and they carried a lot back out again. The Yellowstone left this area with 100 packs of buffalo and muskrat hides, and a pack of buffalo hides was something that you and I would have a tough time picking up. And it's a compressed package of hides. You'd put them in a press and crank the top down on them. That first boat also had on it a fellow by the name of George Catlin. Catlin was a lawyer from New York, East Coast, who had decided that he wanted to be a painter and was not a bad painter, fairly good writer. And he came west to see the Indians. He wanted to record the Indians before they completely disappeared. He went on to Fort Union and spent a little time there, and he went back to Fort Clark and spent time there because there were, in fact, Indians resident there. Fort Union had people in and out, but didn't have a resident population. Catlin was particularly interested in the Mandan, as many people before and after have been. He wrote quite a bit, and he painted, and some of the classic images of the American West are Catlin's. Almost every Earth Lodge painting and every Mandan or Hidatsa painting that you see of Catlin's was done at Fort Clark. There were other villages up here, but he lived at Fort Clark, and that was where he did the bulk of his work. His art style is perhaps a little simplistic when compared to someone like Bodmer, who came the year after, but it caught images, and he was particularly taken with the Okipa, or Sundance ceremony, and in fact wrote a book specifically about that. This, of course, was Victorian era and Victorian morals, if you would, and he was horrified by some of what he saw, and it obviously comes out in his writing that he was horrified. The idea of skewering through the flesh of the breast and hauling somebody up through the smoke hole of an Earth Lodge in the Sundance or Okipa ceremony absolutely horrified him, and he wrote that way. He wasn't particularly impressed with the morals of the people around him either, but I think anytime you get two cultures together, somebody's going to be offended. So Catlin did a fair amount of painting, and some of the classic images that you see are from there. The following year, 1833, Maximilian, who was a German prince, not about to inherit because he was not the first son, decided that he was well educated, and what he wanted to do with his life was to make a contribution to the body of scientific knowledge. I understand that. I've said that to you. That's what I want to do. He went to South America and traveled all through South America, which was then a wild frontier, and wrote a book about his travels there and described the native peoples there. And he went back to Germany and published his book, and everybody said, "Boy, that's a great book, but you're a horrible artist. Why don't you hire an artist the next time you do this?" And so when he came to the northern continent, he hired Karl Bodmer, who was a Swiss landscape artist and illustrator. He particularly worked in illustrating magazines and books, and could produce images on demand. I want you to paint a picture of this scene, and we talk about what the scene is, and Bodmer did a fairly good representation. And he's fairly accurate. If you take his drawings and his paintings and go along the Missouri River where he painted natural features, you can find the exact features that he painted and probably the exact spot that he stood on from a perspective standpoint. So Bodmer and Maximilian came in 1833, spent the winter into 1834. They two came up on a steamboat. Bodmer painted what Maximilian told him to paint and other things that he saw. Maximilian recorded a great deal. He did the first recordation of the North American pocket gopher at Fort Clark, so that the type site for the North American pocket gopher, a critter we all know and love, is at Fort Clark. And there are still people who want to see the original location, to see the pocket gopher that is the type phenomenon, who come to Fort Clark to look at it. He also recorded a grasshopper mouse there, a small brown furry critter. Both Catlin and Bodmer described the people and their customs and the culture. And this was 1832, and then 1833, 34. In 1837, of course, the Mandan were wiped out by smallpox, 98% reduction in population. So that culture, in fact, almost disappeared. We have a good, solid record, both visual and written. One by Catlin, who was pretty staid in his outlook, and one by Maximilian, who was trying very hard to be a scientist and who was trying not to be biased in his opinions. And putting the two of them together, you can get, I think, a pretty good picture. Over the years, then, there were many other people that came to Fort Clark. John James Audubon, who we know of as a bird person, came through there in July of 1843, and as his steamboat got to Fort Clark, he was taken by Francois Chardon, who was still the head trader there, to the bourgeois house, the biggest, fanciest place on the fort, and taken to a loft or a garret above the house where there was a swift fox that Chardon had trapped. And Chardon gave Audubon the swift fox. Audubon went upriver to Fort Union, came back down sometime later, picked up the fox and hauled it all the way back to New York, where he kept it alive for quite some time in a semi-subterranean cage. It was a burrowing fox, so he had to put it below the ground. And I'm sure that the illustration of the swift or kit fox in Audubon's Quadrupeds of North America is that fox which he picked up at Fort Clark. A number of other images exist. In 1847, a Jesuit priest by the name of Father Nicholas Point came through going from Montana to St. Louis, had been called back to his front office, stopped and painted the fort, or drew a drawing of it, and that has only been published once that I know of, and that with a label under it that it says it's in South Dakota, at the Arikara village. Well, there was neither an Arikara village or a Fort Clark in South Dakota in 1847, so I'm sure that it's our Fort Clark. 1851, 52, another Swiss painter by the name of Rudolf Friedrich Kurz came through, and he was broke most of the time, and to support himself, he worked for the fur company, and he worked some at Fort Union, he worked some at Fort Clark, and he wrote a journal. He's one of the few journalists, if you would, who were at or on the Upper Missouri who occasionally admitted a dalliance with women. He was perhaps a little less Victorian in his outlook on life, and he has some odds and ends of drawings which show women bathing. Catlin has only one of those, but it has Catlin laying in the foreground with a telescope, so he may not have been as Victorian as we thought. In 1858, a fellow by the name of Carl Weimar came through this area and drew another drawing of Fort Clark. And then in 1860, an H.J. Hayes came past on a riverboat and did a drawing of Fort Clark from the deck of the riverboat. You're looking up at the fort, obviously looking up the bank. And he also did the only known drawing of Primo's Post, which is a really poorly known place. If you look at all of the artwork, there were some very obvious changes in the fort and in the site over the years. The earlier paintings show an extremely high bluff. The drop-off from the edge of the terrace down to the river bottoms below is 40 to 60-foot drop-off, depending on where you are on the edge of the site. It's about 40 feet at Fort Clark and about 60 feet at the village, at the northeast corner of the village. And earlier on, the river was right up against the north and east sides of this site. And there was a sheer bank. If you look at the particularly at the Bodmers, which are more physically accurate, if you would, they show the physical situation a little bit more cleanly and correctly. It's a very steep drop, almost a cliff. And the blockhouses that are shown on Fort Clark itself at that point are short. They're a story and a quarter tall, and they appear to be located on the northeast and southwest corners of the fort. Chardon, in his journal, mentions in 1839 that he was having trouble with the fort because the rats had eaten the bottom of the posts off, and they had a lot of rat problems in the Upper Missouri and kept trying to bring cats up and couldn't ever establish a cat population up here for a variety of reasons. And he indicated that he had people out replacing the pickets. The early illustrations show these short blockhouses with horizontal logs, like a log cabin built on the northeast and southwest corners, and this very steep bank. As you go later in time, then, starting with the Point drawing in 1847, 10, 12 years after the original drawings were done, the bank starts sloping out as if the river had moved slightly to the east or northeast, And the bank had started being beveled, and you begin to see walkways from the back doors of the forts down to, and from the village down to the river, as if there could have been then a riverboat stop that was a little bit more accessible. And you also see that the blockhouses have changed. The blockhouses are now on the southeast and northwest corners, and are suddenly two-story standard blockhouses that cut over the corner of a building instead of standing outside or inside, actually transect that corner, so that you have the corner of the fort inside the blockhouse. And they become very substantial sorts of things. The function of a blockhouse, of course, is that you hang it off the corner so that a person with a rifle can cover the outside of the wall in either direction, keep somebody from coming up against it and burning it or scaling the wall or whatever. It's like a bastion on the prehistoric site. And by the time we get to 1860, the bank, in the Hayes drawings, the bank appears to be a very gentle slope with a long path that runs down, so the river had begun to move away. Since then, it has moved away completely. Perhaps in the 1890s, when there was a big series of floods, it moved eastward by almost a mile. So if you go to Fort Clark now, the river is not immediately evident. It's some distance away, but you've got the wooded bottoms and sort of marshland down below. You can see a lot of change over the years just looking at the artwork. And the journals that people kept provide all sorts of information about the fur trade, about the kinds of goods coming in and out, about changing social values, about what the Indians were doing and how they related to each other. Great wealth of information.
Fort Clark then existed until 1860, 61? What happened thereafter?
The southern third of the fort burned, Fort Clark burned in 1860. It appears then that the traders from Fort Clark moved to Primo's Post, which was either abandoned or bought out at that point. We're not exactly sure. The reference that I have found is an 1860 newspaper reference which suggests that a steamboat had just come back to St. Louis and reported that Fort Clark had burned on the northern plains and that the traders had moved to the other fort at the property. The only other fort we know of is Primo's Post. In 1861, the Arikara didn't come back to the village. I don't know whether there was some other driving mechanism that caused them to not come back or whether it was the loss of the major fort there. That too may be recorded somewhere in the logs of the fur company, but we haven't gotten that information out yet. So the fur traders wintered there 60 to 61 and then shut the fort down. In 1862, the last of the Arikara moved in with the Mandan and Hidatsa, who had established a village 60 miles north. Modern reference, sorry. 60 miles north at like a fishhook. And the fort and the village were basically abandoned. There were people who came back there. There are references to people coming back and perhaps spending a season living there. I'm sure that in terms of abandoning a place, there were many people who had feelings for the place and came back to it. I'm sure there were burials made there after. There were ceremonies held there. There were stored goods which people came to get over the years. In 1862, Lewis Henry Morgan, one of the fathers of anthropology, was out on a trip in the West and came by in a steamboat and noted that the only things left at Fort Clark itself were two fieldstone chimneys on opposite sides of the fort, we think in the bourgeois house and the men's house, which would have been a barracks for unmarried men. Thereafter, there have been a long string of scientists who have come into the site, references in the 30s and 40s to the site in terms of disease and what effects were there, some early archaeological work. Getting up into the 70s, we've had studies of climatology. We've had studies of both of the prairie vegetation on a terrace and the gallery woods vegetation down on the bottoms. We've had studies of all sorts of critters out there. The archaeologists have been working with the property for years, looking at the village as it's a location where we have both Mandan and subsequently Arikara houses, and we can look at the difference in architecture between those two people. We've got a sort of a field lab in the sense that we know so much about the history of the place that we ought to be able to look at the archaeological record and fine-tune our methods in determining how old something was, how something got to be there, how it was used. We should have, through the company papers that are left, a good record of what kinds of things, at least percentages of things, were brought in. So we ought to be able to look in the village and deal some with trade. If the majority of the beads brought in were in fact blue beads, but the majority of the beads found in the village were not blue, that suggests the Mandan must have been trading the blue beads to someone else. There are all kinds of little things that one can look at like that by comparing the historical record and what one actually finds in the ground. The archaeological research continues today. I did archaeological research there in 1973 and 74 as I ran that site, as we first developed it. There has been a master's thesis written in the last couple of years on flat glass on the prairie frontier, which was largely based on the Fort Clark glass samples that I recovered. W. Raymond Wood from the University of Missouri continues to be interested in the site and has done some testing, some detailed mapping, some proton magnetometer studies. Proton magnetometer is a device which, like radar or sonar, will read a subsurface feature, reads the magnetic field of the Earth, and it'll tell you that there's something below the ground other than just normal ground. It leaves it to you to interpret what that is, and we do work at that some in terms of the fine-tuning of the method. We're still working out how that works. We can find features. We don't know exactly what they are. The site was nominated to and listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1986. And in early 1988, the National Park Service began working on a national landmark status for the site. I think that the site is of national landmark status and suggested that in the National Register nomination because it not only is an important archaeological phenomenon with a great deal of material still intact in the ground, it's also a place where a lot of very important things happened. The simple fact that the Mandan were there in great numbers in 1837 when smallpox made that very major change in their numbers and in their lifestyle is a significant fact on the Northern Plains, significant event. I think the Catlin and Bodmer artwork from the site is something that almost everybody who is even vaguely interested in Western history would recognize if we held up a picture, a photograph of a Bodmer or a Catlin and said, have you ever seen this before? Most people would say, yeah, I'm not sure what it is, but I've seen it. In fact, what they're looking at is Fort Clark on that high bluff. And the ceremonies and the people and the things, the daily events that went on. It's not just rocks and bones, it's people and lives and things that happened.
Can you talk a little bit about the archaeological work that's been done recently at the Fort Clark site?
There were a whole series of small tests over the years. The recent excavations of intensity really started in 1973 and 74 when I moved up to the site as a site supervisor. I was responsible for the development of the site so that the development didn't damage the site. We didn't want to put a house on top of something we would want to interpret later on. And I built fence and did a variety of things like that, but they also hired me as an archaeologist to be there and to think about the place. And we had a series of drawings and descriptions of what the place was and where it was and how big Fort Clark was and that sort of thing. And some vague ideas where Primo's Post was at. Not enough so that I could do a decent interpretation of the property. So I took my field crew, which consisted of 2 high school kids who were on the staff as seasonals and 2 neighborhood youth corps kids the first summer, just 2 people the second summer, and taught them to be archaeologists as best I could, and we went out and ran trenches through the fort particularly. Went after Fort Clark because it seemed that we ought to know something about the major fort on the site if we're going to try to interpret the place. When I got there, the whole place was overgrown, particularly with tumbling mustard and other stocky weeds which stood about nose high on me all across the village and most of the fort area because it was a disturbed area. And I took the 19-inch lawnmower that they gave me out and mowed as much as I could. One of the things I did was mow off Fort Clark to residential lawn level, so we're dealing with 1.5 inches to 2 inches of grass. All of a sudden, all kinds of features started popping out. The fort walls had been placed into a builder's trench, which means that they dug a trench about 6 to 8 inches wide and perhaps a foot deep all the way around the perimeter of the fort, and stuck the vertical pickets down into it and then attached the tops of the pickets together so the bottom of the wall couldn't swing or fall over. This rather than putting it up on a foundation and trying to find some way to stabilize it. When the fort was taken down, the southern third of it burned, and it appears that the rest of the fort then was sort of hand torn down over the years. Lewis Henry Morgan comments that the fort was being torn apart to feed steamboats. And I'm sure the Indians tore wood out of the fort to use as fireplace and wood and to cook firewood and that sort of thing. Anyway, when they tore the wall out of this hole in the ground, it left a hole, which is now about 6 inches wide and about 2 inches deep, 2 to 3 inches deep. You can follow this little linear depression, just a straight line, all the way around the fort. And then on the inside of the fort, some of the buildings were built in the same fashion. I think some of the lean-to sorts of sheds on both the north and south, which were the longer walls of the fort, exactly 10 feet inside that linear trench, there's another one that runs almost the length of the fort, as if there was a lean-to built along it, which I suppose was segmented into all sorts of parts. Then there were some other bigger buildings inside that were built in the same fashion. And there were other buildings there which had been built with horizontal sills and I think log cabin horizontal sorts of buildings, where they laid just enough rock, and these rocks were perhaps that large, a typical field cobble that you'd find in North Dakota. They laid them in a line, just enough of them to hold a horizontal sill up off the ground, and then built from there up. And there were two buildings, one of the Riverside blockhouse and the Bourgeois house, which had laid stone foundations, very solid, very definite foundations. I think because they were the two most substantial buildings on the fort. And as I cleaned this off with a lawnmower, I was able to see the lines, and I was able to see raised rectangular areas where there were foundations. The combination of a foundation and a sodded roof. When the building collapsed, you end up with a sodded roof laying down on top of the foundation, and you end up with a slight raise. There's also some description early on of the middle of the fort courtyard being extremely muddy, and I'm sure that wore down. And in doing some of the archaeological work, we found some layers of sand in there, as if they had tried to sand that area to keep it a little less muddy. So we could find all kinds of things like that. And if you look at the fort now, you can see raised rectangular areas here and there, and you can see where the postern or back gate would have been, because there are two raised areas with a depression in the middle, dead center on the east wall of the fort. What we did with the archaeology was to take 3-foot wide trenches and run them across these building lines on wall lines at right angles. The idea being that if we did that regularly around the buildings and around the fort, we would be able to project wall lines and establish where the corners of buildings were. That would give us the size of buildings. It would give us something about how they were built, because we know what kind of foundation there was there. Running all the way across the building a couple of times, once this way, would give us an artifact sample inside the building and outside the building, because the trenchers went from outside through the building. And we could then separate the artifacts by the location within the fort. We were able to do a little bit with what the building might have been used for. When we went through, we know that there were some particular buildings there because Chardon makes reference to them in his journal, for instance. We know there was a powder magazine because the roof kept falling in. He keeps commenting that they have to replace the roof on the powder magazine again. We know there was an ice house because he had people out collecting ice, chipping or chunking ice out of the river and putting it in straw in the ice house, and they apparently had ice then until late July or early August every year. We know there was a retail store because he mentions that, and because it's a logical thing to have at a fur trading post. When we cross-trenched the retail store area, which is right next to the front gate, we found that building, in fact, had burned. It's one of the buildings that burned in 1860. And of course, when a building like a store burns, you don't get your stuff out of it. So it had a lot of material in it. It had horseshoes, it had axe heads, it had broken china, which probably wasn't broken when the fire happened, was broken as the fire happened. Unused gun flints, all sorts of things like that that were in that store. And we also found a great deal of burned flooring. So we were able to deal with what kinds of things were in a given building, and I think we've pretty well documented that is the retail store on the basis that there were unused materials in it. A building right next to it was full of charred beans. And that's a logical thing. If they're taking beans in and trade to feed themselves with, it comes in the front door of the trader's store, goes out the back door into the storage building. Makes a certain amount of sense. So the archaeology we did there and subsequently at Primo's Post were small trenches running across building lines to try to define the architecture, the building sizes, the fort walls. Never were able to define the gates. I don't know exactly how they put the gates together on either one of these places. We did a little bit of archaeology out in the village itself, a few test trenches, just to get an idea of how deep the site was and how much stratification we would have in there. Because it was originally occupied by the Mandan and then by the Arikara, the Arikara came in 1838, and in 39, in January, the Sioux raided the place, burned the whole place down, from what we understand. So there ought to be a burned layer all the way across there, about in the middle of the stratigraphic situation. And in digging in the village, we found stratified materials. We found houses that had collapsed, and the wood structural remnants were still there, so they're probably the later houses, and we can learn something about the Arikara architecture. I think if we get down into the lower levels of the site and get underneath some of those houses, we can find the Mandan houses and perhaps see some differences in the architecture. The site that ranges, depending on where you're at in the village, from about 1/2 foot to about 2.5 feet deep in terms of the archaeological accumulation there. We have never gone very deep in the site to see if there's anything below what appears to be the sterile level, but that's a possibility too.
Essentially, Fort Clark has value then not only for its history and its role in the changing lives of the Indian populations on the Northern Plains, but also for its scientific,
Yes.
scientific research opportunities
Yes.
there.
And that scientific research started in 1832, really, with Catlin coming in and writing a good ethnographic piece on who these people were and why they did what they did, how they did things, how they lived, what they thought. He talked to them about what do you believe and why do you believe that, and the artwork, and it's continued on ever since, still going on.
And the fort's then overall significance as an historic site would be that it's scientifically and historically
Yes,
a
both.
major location.
It's a multifaceted place. Studies in a dozen different scientific and cultural areas. It is a historically important place simply because of the events that happened there. It's a picturesque place. It's a beautiful place.
And you would be, I would assume, one of its leading advocate of its total and complete preservation.
Yes, I would. I think Fort Clark is the premier post in North Dakota's historic site system. It's not being interpreted very heavily at this point. That, of course, is part of what we're doing here. I think that the site deserves more recognition, and I think that people will be fascinated with it when they see it.
Thank you, Chris.
Pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been another in our Conversations in North Dakota History. Our guest has been Christopher Dill, who is the head of the Museum Division for the State Historical Society of North Dakota. Our topic has been Fort Clark, Field Lab and Prairie Post, 1831 to 1988. This program and the series which it represents part of, the fur trade in North Dakota, has been funded by a grant from the State Historical Society of North Dakota. My name is Larry Remley.